Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So another day, another clarification from Downing Street on the Prime Minister's financial arrangements. This time, Number 10 stresses that there were no offshore trusts or funds that David Cameron or his immediate family would benefit from in future. But tonight, we can reveal details of another fund in Jersey in which the Prime Minister's father had money invested. Paul McNamara reports now on the latest developments in the Panama Papers saga.
So I'll continue to make the case for transparency. This transparency revolution, tax, trade and transparency. But this transparency, tax, trade and transparency.
David Cameron is very keen on transparency. He's so keen that next month he's hosting an international anti-corruption conference. But it seems he's less keen on total transparency when it comes to his own family's financial affairs. For 48 hours, the Prime Minister has been hounded over whether he has benefited from offshore tax havens. Benefited from the fund Blairmore Holdings set up by his father Ian. On Monday, Number 10 was asked whether the Prime Minister's family still had money in his late father's offshore fund. They were told that's a private matter. But Fleet Street disagreed, and yesterday he was forced to make a more detailed statement.
In terms of my own financial affairs, I own no shares. I have a salary as Prime Minister, and I have some savings, which I get some interest from, and I have a house which we used to live in, which we now let out while we're living in Downing Street. And that's all I have. I have no shares, no offshore trusts, no offshore funds, nothing like that. And so that, I think, is a very clear description.
An improvement, but journalists complain that this still didn't quite answer the question. So Number 10 put out another statement.
To be clear, the Prime Minister, his wife and their children do not benefit from any offshore funds. The Prime Minister owns no shares. As has been previously reported, Mrs Cameron owns a small number of shares connected to her father's land, which she declares on her tax return.
And then this morning, yet another statement.
There are no offshore funds or trusts which the Prime Minister, Mrs Cameron or their children will benefit from in future.
But now, a whole 4 statements later, questions still remain. He doesn't benefit now and won't in the future, but has he at any point in the past benefited from the offshore funds set up by Ian Cameron? The Prime Minister's father wasn't just involved in the one fund, Blairmore Holdings, based in the Bahamas. He was also the director of another offshore fund based in Jersey that had various names at various times, including the Close International Equity Growth Fund. These documents show that in 2009, a year before Ian Cameron passed away, he personally owned more than 6,000 shares in it, but it doesn't state the value. Last year, Channel 4 News also obtained documents saying that these assets were passed on to his family when he passed away. So what happened to them, and what were they worth? Mr Cameron isn't just hitting the headlines at home. Internationally, he's gracing front pages alongside, among others, Vladimir Putin and the Icelandic Prime Minister who resigned yesterday. Not the best press a month before hosting an international anti-corruption conference.
The Prime Minister can't lead an anti-corruption summit unless he's got his own house in order, and I think that means answering the outstanding questions about his own tax affairs, particularly the extent to which he or his family have benefited from offshore tax havens in the past.
His boss, Jeremy Corbyn, thinks maybe this is the time for Mr Cameron to come good on a long-held promise to release his tax returns.
I'm very relaxed about publishing these things. There's no secrets about my status. I am paid handsomely as your Prime Minister, and that is my main source of income. And I have a house I used to live in before I moved into Downing Street, and I rent that out and I get the income from that. I don't have other sources of income, so there'll be no surprises in terms of my tax affairs, but I'm very relaxed. As I've always said, nothing's changed about that issue.
Still no sign of a tax return. But tonight, Downing Street did say David Cameron did not discuss the writing of his father's will with him or know the contents of it before he died. He was not an executor of the will. They added he was a beneficiary of a cash legacy. So still, the question remains, has our Prime Minister already benefited from his father's funds offshore.
Let's return to our main report tonight, the latest developments on the Panama Papers. And joining us now to discuss whether the tax affairs of David Cameron's father should matter is the Labour MP and Treasury Select Committee member Wes Streeting. And joining us from North London, the chairman of the Commons Procedure Committee, the Conservative MP Charles Walker. Wes Streeting first. What more do you want to know?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has made a rod for his own back in the last day by not being entirely upfront immediately when asked some pretty straightforward questions about his own tax affairs. And I think there are still some remaining questions about whether he or his immediate relatives have benefited from offshore tax havens
Perhaps
in the
this
past.
Jersey one that we have
and the Jersey issue that's arisen even since I first talked about this first thing this morning. So I think, you know, if I were advising the Prime Minister, he probably doesn't take my advice, but if he were to, I would say that in order to have credibility as the Prime Minister in tackling tax avoidance and offshore tax havens and to talk up the record that he wants to talk up, he's got to have credibility. And the whole essence of this issue is about openness and transparency, and he's got to show some leadership on the issue.
Charles Walker, surely it is important that the Prime Minister has to clarify whether he or his family have benefited in the past from monies earned by his father in offshore tax accounts by whatever means.
Well, if I was advising the Prime Minister, the first thing I'd say is don't listen to Wes Streeting. The Prime Minister is not responsible for the tax affairs of his deceased father. And this is simply ridiculous. At a time when the Prime Minister is personally trying to save steel production in Port Talbot, we've got people talking about the tax affairs of a deceased man. I think the whole thing really is, it's just getting surreal, to be honest.
I'm sorry, we're not talking about the tax affairs of a deceased man. We're talking about the tax affairs of a living Prime Minister. Not necessarily the tax affairs, but the inheritance affairs. If he inherited from any monies earned offshore in any form of tax avoidance, that is an issue for a man who's chairing a summit on the matter.
I mean, David, that is, I'm afraid, nonsense. David Cameron is not responsible for the money he inherited from his father's will. And to pretend otherwise really is pretty disgraceful, and you know it's pretty disgraceful as well. Look, the truth is,
I have no idea whether it's disgraceful or not.
When actors make large sums of money, they get tax advice from lawyers and tax accountants. So the real issue here is around tax avoidance. Should more done be on tax avoidance? It probably should. Going after the Prime Minister's deceased father and somehow trying to make him responsible for decisions his father took is totally ridiculous.
OK, this is ridiculous.
No, and actually, I think I've said throughout the day, actually, that the Prime Minister isn't responsible for the tax arrangements of his parents. But there are two issues about, you know, going back to my point about whether he's benefited personally in the past. And that's, firstly, does he have a conflict of interest when considering these issues? And secondly, when he says he's serious about tackling tax avoidance and he says offshore tax havens are immoral, does he actually mean it? And is he practicing what he preaches?
But this is going after his family, isn't it, really? I mean, you're not really going after...
No, I don't think so. And to be honest, I can only speak for myself, which is I don't believe that politicians should be held accountable for the actions of their relatives. But you've got to judge people against what they say and whether they mean it. And he has not been clear from the outset about his own arrangements. And had he been clear, I don't think he would have had such a terrible time this morning.
Charles Walker.
Yes. Again,
well, your response.
Mr. Streeting, who I have huge personal regard for, is going after the Prime Minister's father. We're talking about... The Prime Minister's father died many years ago, I think 5 or 6 years ago, long before this became an issue at the start of this week. Tax avoidance is a serious issue. I'm sure more needs to be done on tax avoidance. The government's done a great deal, and I'm sure it's going to do a great deal more. It has done a great deal more, I have to say, than 13 years of the Labour government did in this area. So, look, let's be real about this. The Prime Minister should be judged on his actions as the Prime Minister over the past 6 years, and they've been pretty good, to be honest. And it's hard to find much fault with what he's done over tackling tax avoidance. As far as his father's tax affairs are concerned, they are his father's affairs.
We must end it there. Thank you very much, Charles Walker and Mr. Streeting. Thank you very much.
I've been getting away with it all.